Good afternoon, all. Let's get started. This is the Senate Energy and Utilities Finance and Policy Committee meeting of September 10th, 2022. We have one bill before us today. Senator Benson, you might as well come forward. You are our star today, and going to be talking about Senator Johnson. Do you have 3661?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Okay. I'm not sure, I don't have this mislabeled on here, but nonetheless, Senator Benson, why don't you move forward with your bill, and then we have a litany of testifiers to speak to the whole subject of carbon sequestration, and we really look forward to this today, and not only your bill, but to the information that is going to be shared with us. So, Senator Benson, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I've always believed that Minnesota should be the place where what happens next gets its start. And as we look at a world that is demanding more carbon neutral or carbon-free products, Minnesota can be part of that solution, and that's what this bill is about. Carbon capture and carbon sequestration, that it is a state policy that is an acceptable method of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in order to achieve our state goals as established by your predecessors in this committee members. And so with that, I understand we have a lot of presenters. I think Minnesotans should hear what's possible as we look for a new energy future and a new world market that expects green energy to be part of our solutions and carbon neutral products to be in high demand.
Good. So members, Senator Benson has a fairly short and succinct bill, but easily read. I kind of like those. And, are there any questions to Senator Benson on our bill at this point? If not, we can move into the testifiers. And I believe the first one is Mr. Kevin Connors, right? Do I have that correct?
Yes, Chairman Senjum.
Okay. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Connors, and please proceed as you are ready.
Chairman Senjum, I'm just waiting for the link so I can share my presentation.
Fine. We can wait until certainly you are ready. Are we working on technology here? Is that it?
Okay. Chairman Senjum, yes. I just need the link, Senator Lee.
I would announce we have a quorum present, so for the record. For those in the audience beyond this room, we're working on technology. Okay. We finally got there. So very good. So Mr. Connors, please proceed as you are now ready.
Chairman Senjum, committee members, thank you for this opportunity to present on this bill. It's an honor to be here and presenting. My name is Kevin Connors. I work for the Energy and Environmental Research Center at the University of North Dakota. My title at the university, at the EERC, is Assistant Director for Regulatory Compliance and Energy Policy. I have a background in geology, background in petroleum engineering, and worked for the state of North Dakota for over 8 years, where I helped develop the carbon capture and storage regulatory frameworks for the state of North Dakota, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. I also manage a large consortium research or R&D program called the Plains CO2 Reduction Partnership. We will talk about that today. The P-Core Partnership is a U.S. Department of Energy research program that's focused on advancing carbon capture, utilization, and storage across a region of the Northern Great Plains. It's a research program that's been doing applied research in CCS for about 20 years now, so 2 decades of applied research in CCS. Just want to start out with who the EERC is. We are a large research facility located on the University of North Dakota campus. We have extensive facilities and highly technical staff of over 250 employees. We have core areas of research that we focus on in coal utilization and emissions. Carbon management is what I would be talking about today. Oil and gas, alternative fuels and renewable energy, and the energy-water nexus. So we're a business branch or business unit of the University of North Dakota focused on scientific research around energy and environmental challenges. So let's talk a little bit about carbon management. I think it's accepted by the scientific community. And the scientific community agrees that CCS, or the technology of carbon capture and storage, is a key technology to significantly reducing our CO2 emissions in an impactful way in order to mitigate our CO2 or anthropogenic CO2 emissions reductions goals. At the same time, we see CCS as an opportunity to not only manage our carbon dioxide across our region, but also provide affordable, resilient, and reliant electricity as well, and other types of energy. The EERC and the work we do in research and development, we are a global leader in this area of carbon management, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But first, I want to get into what carbon capture and storage is, just a general overview. We're talking about capturing carbon dioxide from large stationary sources of CO2, transporting that CO2 to the ideal geologic formation, and injecting that CO2 deep into the earth. And that's where my expertise comes in. With my background in geology and my background in petroleum engineering, also I have a background in the policy around and the regulatory frameworks around making sure this is done properly and safely. And so when we talk about carbon storage or geologic storage of carbon dioxide, it all starts with the geology. We look for very specific criteria when we want to inject carbon dioxide for deep storage, permanent storage. And that starts with, there's a certain depth threshold that we need to meet. So when we're looking for the appropriate geologic formation to store carbon dioxide, we look at the depth, we look at the porosity and the permeability, and I'll get into a little bit of detail on each one of these. A good cap rock, an appropriate rock that will accept the CO2, appropriate salinity levels. So we're looking for formations that do not contain sources of drinking water, but it's actually poor quality water within those formations, and they're deep geologic formations. And then we're also looking to make sure there's no natural leakage pathways. And so what we want to do at the surface is we want to compress our carbon dioxide molecules to make it a dense CO2 phase or supercritical phase. And and that allows us to store more CO2 in the subsurface as we go through a phase change and make that carbon dioxide molecule more dense. and then we're able to inject that into a certain depths or meeting a certain depth threshold in the earth to ensure that that carbon dioxide stays down in the subsurface. We're looking for rocks that have the not only the pore space, but the networks that connect those pore spaces to allow the carbon dioxide to allow the rock that allows the rock to accept the carbon dioxide in terms of through the injection well for storage purposes. And then on top of that, we need a rock that will, or a rock formation or a geologic formation that will contain the CO2 within the rock. So we need a cap rock that has no permeability or no porosity. As we look for these certain criteria, it leads us to ideal areas to store CO2, and that's some of the work that we've done at the EERC. We've identified the major, or the ideal sedimentary basins in our region that would be ideal for large-scale CO2 storage. So here's just a simple example of porosity and permeability. This is what we're looking for. On the right there, you'll see there's great porosity in there, but there's not permeability. The porosity is not connected. And so when we look at rock formations or geologic formations, as we characterize those scientifically, we're looking for those rock formations that have both really good porosity and really a good permeability. A great example is this rock formation. What you're seeing here is a core. We have cored different formations in western North Dakota and identified the ideal formations for large-scale CO2 storage. And this one here in particular has been identified as the primary target for CO2 storage. You can see it's a sandstone just by the naked eye there. But this formation has really good porosity and really good permeability for large-scale storage of CO2. So I mentioned the Peace Corps Partnership region, and as you see on the map here, this is an outline of the regional perspective that we have at the EERC. The Energy Environmental Research has led the Peace Corps Partnership for about 20 years now, where we've performed applied research in CCS. And as you can see here, I'm just going to point to the Williston Basin in western North Dakota has been identified as an ideal sedimentary basin for large-scale geologic storage of carbon dioxide. As you can see on the map, the state of Minnesota geologically just does not have the sedimentary layers and the criteria that I just went through for large-scale CO2 storage. So any CO2 emissions reductions through capture would have to be through transport to a region like North Dakota where we have ideal geologic formations for storage of carbon dioxide. What I have here on the screen is a generalized cross-sectional view of the map I just showed you, showing the Williston Basin and the deep Williston Basin. And so we're looking for rock formations today, and we've been doing science on the rock formations that are about 1 mile to 3 miles deep in terms of identifying those formations that we can inject CO2 into that will be ideal to make sure that CO2 is safely and permanently stored in the subsurface. And in addition to that, we characterize everything from the surface down. So we're looking at our underground sources of drinking water, we're looking for our freshwater sources, and we're looking to protect those, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But then we're also looking for the right formations that will act as sealing formations or impermeable formations that will contain the CO2 as well as the good sandstone or other types of sedimentary rock that we can store that CO2. And you can see here, this is a little bit exaggerated, but this is the basin. And as we move from west to east, the basement rock or the hard rock comes up. And so that's a good indication of the geology underneath our feet here today, where we're on top of the basement, and we need to go over to a place like the Williston Basin, where it has this pancake geology, these layers of sedimentary rock that are sandstones, shales, limestones, and they're ideal for this activity of storing carbon dioxide. So the intent behind what we're looking to do in terms of managing our carbon emissions, and in this case storing our carbon dioxide, is we're looking to ensure that human safety is the utmost importance, and also protecting the environment. And so there's there's a regulatory program or a policy framework in place to do that, and that's where some of my expertise comes in. So we look at where our freshwater zones are, where our drinking water is, and we ensure that the well that will inject that CO2 into the subsurface is constructed and designed in a manner to protect underground sources of drinking water. And so this program, the regulatory program that I'm talking about, is rooted in the Safe Drinking Water Act, and it's called the Underground Injection Control Program. It's been around for about a little over 40 years now, but the idea of injecting CO2 for storage purposes has been around for about 12 years. And so that's the newest well class in this program, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But it's the program is designed to identify the geologic criteria that I just went over and require that for any sort of large-scale storage project, and also prescriptive requirements on what the wellbore construction looks like. And so, you know, this is something I really enjoy. I get to talk about rocks, I get to talk about engineering, and I get to talk about policy and kind of how they all fit together, right? And so the geology is important, and that's where it starts. And then we have the ability to engineer these wells in a manner that's safe, that can inject the CO2 once it's captured from major stationary facilities and transported to the site. We can inject it deep in the earth permanently and safely to protect the environment and protect human health. And so the way we construct these wells is, here's a diagram on the right. It starts with, and it's because of the regulatory program and the frameworks we're working with, it's about protecting underground sources of drinking water. And so as we drill these wells, we drill them through our freshwater zones. We run steel casing and cement once we get through our freshwater zones to protect those. That's the first line of defense. And then we continue to drill to the injection zone, and we run steel casing further down there, and then we cement that to surface. Those are four more layers of there's 4 layers of defense, and then we run another steel tubing, and that is the injection tubing. It's isolated by an isolation packer, and so that is the only material that comes in contact with CO2. And in doing that, you're able to monitor the space between the tubing and the casing. That's the annular space, and you can continuously monitor that to ensure that the CO2 that you're injecting down the wellbore will go out into the formation and stay there. And so I'll talk a little bit about our monitoring techniques to not only ensure that the CO2 has stayed where we put it and is permanently stored, but also we have a redundant monitoring system where we monitor our groundwater as well and our soil gas, just to make sure that there's no leakage pathways that exist. But you know, that said, when we characterize these sites, when we go into site screening, we want to develop a CO2 storage project, we're looking for leakage pathways. We're looking for anything that would act as a conduit for this injected CO2 to come to the surface. And so there's certainly an approach there that is mitigating any risks before CO2 is ever injected. So talk a little bit about the policy now. We've talked about the geology. We've talked about the petroleum, the engineering or the wellbore construction, and kind of how they fit together. And I've mentioned the underground injection control program. I just want to talk a little bit about this word primacy, and I'm sure you're maybe familiar with the different maybe regulatory programs where the federal government develops the minimum standard, and then the state applies for the authority or the primary regulatory authority. In other words, primacy. In North Dakota is the first state in the country to apply for this regulatory authority, and Wyoming is the second, and both states have received that authority to regulate this activity. Anywhere else in the country, it's regulated by EPA today, and so North Dakota has been a leader in developing these regulatory frameworks. North Dakota saw in the early 2000s, not only did we have the proper geology and the understanding to store CO2, but we also wanted to develop the regulatory frameworks for the industry that we see today developing projects in western North Dakota. We wanted to have those frameworks in place so they knew that they can move forward and develop their projects in a safe manner in terms of injecting and storing CO2 permanently. And so I mentioned the underground injection control program. This program's been around since the early 80s. It was developed from the Safe Drinking Water Act. Today there's 6 injection well classes. The class 1 is a hazardous waste well. Class 2 is injection for oil and gas activity. It's associated with oil and gas activity. Class 3 is for solution mining. Class 4 does not exist anymore. Class 5 is non-hazardous liquids. And the newest well class that came out in 2010 is Class 6. 6. That's for the injection of carbon dioxide for geologic storage. Now, this program has really there's some really key fundamental pieces to this regulatory program that ensure that all projects moving forward cannot get permitted or operate without meeting certain criteria. And I've already went over some of those, but it's protection of underground. It all starts with the protection of underground sources of drinking water. You must have you must have an injection zone that you've characterized and that you understand the geology and that it will indeed accept the CO2, but also you must also have a geologic formation above that that will confine the CO2 in place. The CO2, once you inject it, will act as a buoyant fluid and it will rise, and so you need to have a cap rock that will contain that CO2, and you need to, and then in addition, looking at wellbore integrity, you ensure that your wellbore that's injecting CO2 will not act as a leakage pathway. And so we focus a lot on how that well is designed and constructed. And then in addition, there's this term area of review. We evaluate everything around the project area. There's an area of interest that we evaluate to make sure that that project area is ideal for safe and permanent geologic storage of carbon dioxide. So a little bit more about wellbore construction. I'm not going to get into a whole lot more detail, but this is an injection well class. It was developed by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency under the Safe Drinking Water Act. There's specific material requirements that account for the potential corrosivity of CO2. Now keep in mind, carbon dioxide itself is not corrosive. When it's dry, when it's introduced to water, that's when it becomes corrosive. And so as we have dry CO2, our corrosion concerns aren't there, but as we inject it into formations that contain water, that's where we enter a corrosive environment. So our well bores that we construct are constructed in the injection part of the geologic formation. At the bottom of the wellbore, we construct those materials with CO2 resistant materials. It's CO2 resistant casing and CO2 resistant cement to ensure that the CO2 in the injection zone or in the geologic horizon does not corrode the wellbore. So, you know, what I'm trying to demonstrate is that there are adequate safeguards in place for this activity. There's oversight over this activity, and it's a well-regulated activity with well-thought-out regulations for this activity. I'm going to finish up with monitoring the CO2. So we have, I mentioned we have redundant ways to monitor. First of all, as we inject carbon dioxide for storage, we are required to monitor directly in the injections in the horizon. So that includes monitoring wells, and then indirectly where we can take advantage of technologies such as geophysical technology to take readings in the earth, and we can actually track the carbon dioxide as it moves into the formation. We can see it underground periodically. We can also monitor our wells, and we can run different geophysical tools within our wells to monitor the injection of CO2 and to make sure that our well has mechanical integrity. In addition to that, we monitor our groundwater systems throughout. We actually begin before injection begins. We begin taking baseline samples so we understand the water chemistry before we begin injecting CO2. And then we also develop establish a baseline for soil gas. And so we understand our soil gas, our naturally occurring CO2 in our soils. And we can compare that with the isotopic signature of the CO2 that's being injected versus the naturally occurring CO2 in the soils. On top of the required monitoring that I just kind of breezed over rather quickly, keep in mind the current business case for large-scale CO2 storage requires accounting of that CO2. And so not only are you required through the underground injection control program to monitor your CO2, but in order to receive, say, the 45Q tax credit, or maybe if it's an ethanol plant, a low carbon fuel standards market, there's an accounting mechanism that has a redundant layer of monitoring to ensure that the CO2 indeed that is injected, that the incentive has paid out for, stays there and is permanently stored. This is my last slide here, and so I just wanted to, trying to demonstrate that the regulatory safeguards are in place. The oversight is in place for this activity to be done safely. We have the right geology, and certainly in western North Dakota, to do this at a wide-scale deployment level. and it can be done. It can be done safely. It can be done in an environmentally safe manner. And in addition to that, we've developed at the EERC through the P-Core partnership, or the Plains CO2 Reduction Partnership, an adaptive management approach. And what this shows is, as we start out screening for sites, we're looking for a location to store large-scale storage of CO2. As we're doing our site screening, we're collecting data and we're doing site characterization work in here, and that moves into, we actually build out very complex geologic models with the site-specific information, and we run simulations. We predict the CO2 in the subsurface. That informs our risk assessment as we perform risk assessment, and that informs our monitoring, verification, and accounting. And as we move into the feasibility stage, where we're working on, is this site feasible? Is this the right site to store CO2? Again, we collect more data that feeds into the adaptive management approach with site characterization. We're continually updating our model and our simulation to be as accurate as we can in predicting the CO2 in the subsurface, and we update our risk assessment. We're evaluating risks of the site and also identifying strategies for monitoring the stored CO2. And so we have a very methodical approach in terms of adapting and managing the development of a CO2 storage project moving forward. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I appreciate that it's an honor to be able to present before you today, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Connors. And before we get into questions, I have one for Senator Benson. It's relative to your bill. So this is certainly a combination of your bill, of course, and that's first and foremost. But we've got a lot of information presentations here that we're also giving, which are certainly important to your bill. But I know that you have a schedule as well. This might take a little while longer. Would you like to sit around, or would you like us to kind of act on your bill? Your preference.
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure how long the schedule for presentations is, but I can stay for another 15 minutes or so. If I want to learn as much as I can if I'm going to be the author, so I'll stay for another 15 minutes.
Well, you sort of give me the sign when you think that you need to leave. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We'll sort of wrap that up. So I have a question relative, actually several. So it's like, help me understand. So you got the CO2, gaseous CO2 out of the stack. Do you put that into the earth in a gaseous state or a liquefied state? That's the first question.
Chairman Senjum, you actually, what you want to do is you want to compress that CO2 into a more dense state of supercritical. Right. And so you want to reach the supercritical state at the surface. And so as you inject it, you'll ensure that it stays supercritical into the subsurface. And
so is the supercritical state liquid? It's still gaseous.
It's the state supercritical. It's right between gaseous liquid state, where the CO2 molecule is the most dense. So we're talking, I think approximately 89 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,080 degrees, or 1,080 psi.
But it's still compressed gas at that point. Is that what you're saying?
It's right at the state where, in the phase change, where it's going to be supercritical. It's going to be right between gaseous and liquid.
Okay, but what really is it? I mean, it's there. I mean, it's either one or the other.
It's getting to be more liquid than gaseous.
Okay, and so at that point, then the near liquefied gas goes into. I know one of the slides talked about the Deadwood Formation. So does it just permeate that formation? I mean, I'm trying to understand. Okay, we put it down the pipe, and it's going to go this way and that way, and it's going to seek the path of probably least resistance. And how long can you do? I mean, let's say the life of a power plant's 50 years. Although some of the power plants, Milton Young's, they've been around, but. How long can it do that in a formation? Of course, you showed us some formations which are, half the size of Canada and a lot of North Dakota. So that's pretty. So you just continue to pump that near gasified liquid, or gasified near liquid carbon dioxide down, and it just permeates the rock. Is that it?
Chairman Senjum,
it's not going into a cave, right?
Correct. You're talking about it. It's
Right.
actually, when you envision the rock, you can think of,
Right.
of a sponge.
Sure.
That's why we're looking for the porosity and the permeability in that rock with the right characteristics for it to accept that CO2, and the CO2 works its way into the pore space. Within the rock, you have actually a more dense liquid. It's a salt water. It's a saline formation. It's a poor water quality formation is honestly what we're looking for. We call it saline storage. And with that, the CO2 molecule, although it's dense, it's less dense than the water within the formation. And so what happens as you inject CO2, it kind of rises up, and we call it, a good visual would be like a whale tail. And it rises up and it comes up. That's why you want to have that cap rock in order to contain the CO2 within the formation, and then it spreads out. And that's how we're able to monitor the CO2 over time. Now the projects that we've seen today are looking for injection durations of 20 years.
Okay.
And we're talking about areas that are maybe 5 square miles.
Okay. And you spoke a little bit, I thought about like, well, we're doing it now, but are you doing it now? I know Milton Young's working on a project, I don't think it's built yet, but is this active in North Dakota at this point, at any location?
Chairman Senjum, committee members, we are days or weeks away from the first active storage project in North Dakota. To date, we have 3 permits have been issued for geologic storage of carbon dioxide. You mentioned the Milton R. Young Station, and Project Tundra has 2 permits that they received. And the first permit that was received was from an ethanol production facility, Red Trail Energy in Richardson, North Dakota. And they're currently developing their project to be injecting CO2 this year.
Okay, thank you. Members, any questions? Senator Friends?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Benson. Thank you, Mr. Connors. I'm just going to refer to the University of North Dakota, but you're working for the Department of Energy Policy, Energy and Environment Research Center, right? And that's why we're doing this, because we're going to sequester this carbon, and that's better than putting it in the atmosphere. Is that fair?
Chairman Senjum, Senator
Mr. Connors,
Friends.
yes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. And so, Mr. Connors, the reason that that's a good thing is to decrease the amount of carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere on a monthly or yearly basis, right?
Mr. Connors?
Correct.
And does your regulatory compliance and energy policy, Energy and Environment Research Center have any research or opinions about how quickly we need to decarbonize this atmosphere?
Mr. Connors?
Well, our focus is on not only decarbonizing, but ensuring that we're providing resilient, dispatchable, reliable energy that's affordable as well. And so as we go down that path, that's why in the beginning of my testimony or presentation, I talked about carbon management, how we see the ability to not only manage our carbon emissions, but also allow for a robust energy industry, right? And to be able to have ultimately affordable and reliable electricity generated as we manage the carbon dioxide emissions.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Friends?
Mr. Connors, I appreciate that. I'm with you. I want to have reliable, affordable energy, and I think everyone in the country does too. What I'm asking is, do you have a research opinion about how much of a hurry we're in to decarbonize, taking into account climate change?
Mr. Connors?
You know, our focus is on reducing those emissions as it makes sense in terms of a business case, right? We certainly see carbon capture and storage as a key tool that we need in our toolbox to be able to achieve the emissions goals that our country set out on, and in North Dakota, our state has set out on. The governor of North Dakota, Governor Burgum, has set goals for us to be, at the state of North Dakota, to be carbon neutral by 2030. And that's something that certainly we are working with our industries and our power industries to try to achieve that ambitious goal.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Robbins, part of a little bit larger conversation. And by the way, I'm not smart enough to understand the safety. I'm going to give you safety for this point, but let me try it this way. The state of Minnesota is putting out 161 million tons of carbon a year. Can carbon sequestration technology capture half of that each year with the basins that you're telling us about? Is that realistic?
Mr. Connors?
Chairman Senjum, committee members, what we're able to capture today with current technology is off of major stationary sources or stationary sources of CO2. So there's a transportation infrastructure or transportation emissions will have to be looked at differently from your overall state emissions. But in terms of, I think part of your question was related to the geology. Certainly within the Williston Basin, we have the storage resources, how we look at it. We have the storage resource capacity to store large volumes of CO2 for an extended period of time.
Mr. Chair, I promise this is my last question for now, although I have a couple for you, Senator Benson, if you're taking off. I guess what I'm driving at is when you say large capacity for a long period of time, and some of us are counting millions of tons of carbon, can you put any numbers on that? I'm asking you, if the state of Minnesota puts out 161 million tons a year, is this technology going to be able to sequester half of it in a year for 20 years or 50 years or for a week? Or, what are we talking? Is there endless capacity? I mean, these are big basins. Maybe it's enough to sequester carbon for a millennium. Just, if you're able to give us some boundaries on that, that's helpful. If not, that's fine too, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Connors?
Yeah, Chairman Senjum, committee members, North Dakota has ideal geology for this activity, and we've looked at it in terms of our storage resource in terms of billions. And so we see, upwards of 200 billion tons of CO2 being able to be stored. A good example, and just that one formation that I mentioned, the Broom Creek Formation that we characterized starting in 2003. And since that time, we have not only characterized it with the existing data that we have, but we've collected thousands of foot of core just in the last 5 years. And we've taken that core out of the ground and we've evaluated in the laboratory, and we've done series of testing on that core. And we've not only evaluated that rock, but we evaluated the rock formations that overlie and underlie that rock to ensure that the CO2 will be safely stored in that rock. I think the committee members are familiar with Project Tundra. Project Tundra is a project that's looking, I want to say roughly 4 million tons a year from the Milton R. Young Station that they want to be able to capture and store right there at their site where they've targeted the Broom Creek Formation. I think we have today, with the science that we know, we have capacity, and Project Tundra wants to do that for 20 years is the project. We have capacity for at least 100 Project Tundras with confidence.
Senator Friends.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Connors. I wrote down 200 billion. I appreciate it. We do want to look at this technology. I'm just trying to put some, perspective on it as we make choices for clean, reliable, and affordable energy. Thanks again. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anybody else? Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Benson, for bringing this forward. Mr. Connors, I have a couple questions. As you drill and you put this pipe down, do you use multiple drilling sites, or is it just one site that's going to take care of everything?
Mr. Connors?
Chairman Senjum, committee members, Senator Newton. So that question depends on the scale of the project. Certainly a project that's the scale of, say, a single ethanol plant, a one well injection well design would certainly be sufficient based on the amount of the volumes of CO2 that you'd want to be sequestering. Now, when you're looking at a project where you're maybe at the scale of 1 million tons of CO2 or 4 million tons of CO2 a year that you would like to inject and store long term, you may be looking at a multi-well injection pattern with also included with monitoring wells, making sure that CO2 is migrating in the subsurface as predicted.
And Mr. Connors, Mr. Chair, as you do have multiple drilling holes, how do you cap them? Is there a point at which you've saturated the soil, or the what do you call it, the landing storage, or the lead storage area? Is there at some point where it's capped and you've got as much CO2 in there as you can possibly get, and then you have to move to another place for drilling?
Chairman Senjum.
Mr. Connors.
Committee members. So there, as I talked about the regulatory frameworks of these types of projects, This is probably one of the most stringent regulatory programs that exists in terms of the injection well classes, all 6 injection well classes. This is, in some cases, is more stringent than a Class 1 hazardous waste well. And so at the time of permitting, not only do you need to be able to define the mechanisms of confinement and the geologic characteristics of the subsurface to ensure that the CO2 is safely stored, but you need to develop plugging and abandonment plans. And then you also need to have financial assurance or financial responsibility around those types of plans. And so that's typically in these projects at the time of permitting, the applicant will set aside a cash bond or surety bond to plug those wells. It's over $100,000 type bond that remains in place until those wells are plugged and abandoned. And the oil and gas industry over 50 or 100 years has given us a really great understanding of how to properly and safely plug a well. And so the way that these wells are closed out is you begin by setting cement plugs, and you begin by going all the way down the well, and you squeeze off those perforations that you're injecting CO2 into for over 20 years or however long the life of the project is. And then as you come up the well, you continue to leave cement plugs that are hundreds of foot thick in that well all the way up to the surface. And so you have a series of cement plugs that isolate the injection zone from the surface waters and ultimately the surface, and then you're able to cut that well off below the surface and weld the steel cap on. And that's the North Dakota rule, generally speaking, as I can be.
Okay. And Mr. Chair, if I may continue, Mr. Connor, my concern is when I look at this one slide that you've got here, it shows the gradation of the storage area from about 14,000 feet up to 1,000 feet before it hits, it gets closer to the surface of the ground. And I guess I'm concerned about leaching. If there's a chance of any of the CO2 leaching into drinking water or groundwater, and you'd mentioned that this storage area is sort of a spongy type. Is it possible that CO2 can spread up and get closer to the surface of the ground itself? Not only coming up through the holes that you've drilled and leaching that way, but also spreading out and coming up where it's not as deep.
Mr. Connors?
Chairman Senjum, Senator Newton, committee members, that's a great question. I really appreciate that question because that is the foundational piece of the policy that's in place. And so and it's all about protecting underground sources of drinking water, and it's all about ensuring that whatever's injected down the well stays there as permitted and as predicted prior to ever having any injection activity. And so, if we can, just please talk about the Williston Basin in North Dakota and maybe some of these formations that we've identified as the primary targets for CO2. I've talked a lot about just the single cap rock, the rock that sits on top, that's impermeable, that will act as the first line of defense from the CO2 rising through the stratigraphic column or through the different geologic units. North Dakota is very fortunate with the geology that we have, because we're not just talking about a single shale layer, we're talking about thousands of foot of shale. And so, let's talk about our groundwater systems in the western part of the state where we're developing these projects. We have all of our fresh drinking water zones go from the surface to about 1,500 to 2,000 foot deep, okay? And those are the zones that we protect. And that's the first line of defense. When we drill a well, we run casing in there to protect those. Below those freshwater zones, we have a Pierre shale formation that's a Cretaceous shale that's thousands of foot thick. And below that, we have a Colorado group of formations that are additional shales. And so we have a series of shales that are thousands of foot thick that are above, that even in the worst case scenario that the CO2 escaped the injection zone above the first line of defense, there's thousands of foot of shale that we characterize as we permit these projects. And so the way the regulatory framework is around that is not only do we identify the injection zone and the upper confining zone, but we identify the additional zones of confinement that we work out into these, that we demonstrate to the regulator that yes, indeed, there's multiple lines of defense to ensure that the carbon dioxide that's injected does not rise up out of the injection zone. Now, in this area, in terms of the underground injection control program, in this program, what we really look at are a few things. Okay, we identify the geology to make sure it has the right characteristics, but we also do what I talked about, that area of review where we evaluate everything around the project area, even beyond where we predict the CO2 will go. And we look for a few things. We look for transmissive faults or fractures. We look for anything that's going to act as a conduit. Or we also look for maybe an old well bore. And we make sure if there's anything in there that penetrates that injection zone that the CO2 will come in contact with, or the pressure front and the pressure that'll push out as we inject CO2, we make sure that there's no conduit or no pathway outside of the injection zone, that indeed we can say with confidence at the time of permitting, and then also throughout the operational life, we're doing that monitoring that I talked about to ensure that the CO2 stays exactly where it is. And so we're looking for exactly those things that you mentioned. We're looking for those leakage pathways to have confidence that we can move forward with these. And not only is the project developer looking for that, but also the state regulator is. And that's my previous role with the state of North Dakota, is I've permitted over 100 underground injection control permits. And not only when that regulator receives that permit, there's an extensive evaluation to say, okay, did they miss anything? Did they account for everything that we're looking for in terms of criteria? And so that is, that's the foundational piece of that program that stems from the Safe Drinking Water Act, and has, we have it's a great time right now because we have 40 years of experience in injecting fluids deep into the subsurface.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Connor, for that comprehensive explanation. And I know that Senator Frentz had some questions for Senator Benson that he'd like to ask. So.
Senator Frentz, is that true?
It's true, Mr. Chair, but I didn't mean to interrupt the rest of the testimony or the other witnesses if Senator Benson's planning more testimony. And also, was not sure, Mr. Chair, if we're planning to lay this over or actually vote this out.
Yeah, we're going to lay this over, but maybe we just may call a little bit of a timeout here in the informational aspects of this hearing to deal with this bill. Is there anybody in the audience, either here or virtually, that wants to speak to Senate File 3661?
And Mr. Chair.
Okay. Senator Benson, any concluding comments on it, and we'll let you move along.
Mr. Chair, I will plan to depart here shortly, but I believe there are other people who are presenting, because there's more than just geologic carbon sequestration. There's mineralization. There are a number of different ways that we can keep CO2 out of the atmosphere in long-term permanent storage, which is what people are looking for as technology companies look to buy carbon credits. They're seeking permanent storage because that is what the value in those carbon credits are. So it's not just this form of carbon capture, but there are emerging technologies. And I think Minnesota can be a state where we lead. We have always been a state of innovation and stewardship of our natural resources. And that's why I think this bill is a good fit for our forward look at energy and our future here in Minnesota.
Good. Thank you, Senator Benson. With that, then, Senate File 3661 is set aside for possible inclusion. And thank you, Senator Benson, for presenting the bill and being with us today. We understand your schedule. And it's an hour and 25 minutes. Moving on. Let's see. Anything else that you had, Mr. Connors, or? I think you came to the end of your PowerPoint. Are there any other questions for Mr. Connors? Senator Eerc, did you have one of the witness? Oh, okay. Let's move on then to thank you so much, Mr. Connors, for coming down. If you want to hang around, we've got a couple seats there. How about we bring forward, is it Harvey Thorlovsen? Is Mr. Thorlovsen here? Okay. I don't, yes, anyone with a microphone. Welcome to the committee. Please state your name because I probably didn't state it very well, and, yeah, even though I'm somewhat Norwegian. But state your name and proceed as you're ready.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Harvey Thorlovsen. I am a University of Minnesota professor and director of the Minnesota Geological Survey. I therefore fulfill the role of State Geologist of Minnesota. I appreciate this opportunity to speak on science related to potential development and deployment of carbon capture and sequestration technologies in Minnesota. Concerns about climate change have resulted in assessment of ways to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, which I will refer to as CO2, while preparing for increasing climate change and variability. Emissions reductions can be achieved by reducing fossil fuel combustion, by decreasing other activity that generates greenhouse gases, and or by averting the venting of these gases to the atmosphere. In addition, greenhouse gases may be recovered from the atmosphere as enhanced vegetation and or soil carbon. Also, technology for recovering CO2 from the atmosphere is in development. In Minnesota, the most readily captured CO2 sources would be at ethanol plants, and also from coal and gas-fired electrical generating stations. To a degree, captured CO2 can be used for industrial purposes, such as in enhancing the recovery of oil, for example, at oil wells in North Dakota. More likely, as industrial capacity to consume CO2 is exceeded, the fate of captured CO2 would be storage by geologic sequestration. This could occur by injection as a liquid-like, in a liquid-like state, as we just heard from Kevin, into non-reacting deep underground saline formations, from which leakage could be possible, or by reaction of CO2 with suitable material to produce a benign solid product, either above ground or below. A potential option for deep injection of Minnesota CO2, as we just heard from our previous speaker, is export from stationary sources by pipeline to sites such as in North Dakota or Illinois, for example, where suitable geology has been confirmed. There has been consideration of whether suitable geology could be found in Minnesota, thereby enabling deep injection into non-reacting formations without the need for export by pipeline. A report commissioned by this legislature and produced by us at the Minnesota Geological Survey in 2008, however, concluded that there is a very low probability that suitable geologic conditions for sequestration of CO2 by injection alone could be confirmed in Minnesota, as Kevin indicated. Our report considered the only rocks in Minnesota with any reasonable potential to have the required properties, which are sequences of sedimentary rocks extending southwest from Lake Superior to Kansas. Criteria for confirmation of this potential would include, again, Kevin nicely covered this, depth, porosity, permeability, the seal, the integrity, the chemistry, and adequate data availability. Our negative conclusion related to insufficient data, lack of promising indications in preliminary data, and reason to believe that suitable properties are unlikely due to age and history of the candidate rocks. That's why Kevin focused on North Dakota. In contrast, reaction of CO2 to produce a benign solid product, referred to as mineral carbonation, is much more prospective in Minnesota, pending consideration of costs and other relevant considerations. This method was partially described for the Minnesota context in a report commissioned by this legislature and produced by us in 2011. This excellent potential in Minnesota is related to the particular composition of rocks in the Duluth complex north of Lake Superior and in nearby related rocks, where there is potential for development of one or more mines that could produce nickel and other metals. A plausible scenario is for potential mine waste to be reacted with CO2 to produce a stable and benign solid product. In addition, there is potential for CO2 to be injected into rocks of this composition, where properties such as porosity and permeability allow, resulting in reaction and thus preempting the potential for leakage. There has been related research accompanying other work on soil and vegetation-related methods on whether minerals could be added to soil to cause reaction with atmospheric CO2 to produce solid products that would remain in the soil. These methods do not entail capture, so they're outside of our topic today, I believe. The mineral carbonation method has shown promise due to the great abundance of suitable minerals, progress on methods, the ability to treat gases without separation of CO2, potentially usable products, and lack of leakage risk or long-term monitoring requirements, although cost is a compelling consideration. The scenario that was examined in our report related to the potential for one or more mines in this region to produce suitable waste in relation to potential production of nickel, copper, and other metals. The rocks that could produce these metals in Minnesota happen to have the characteristics required to have the potential to react with CO2. There also is potential for CO2 to be injected into and reacted with these rocks. In contrast, waste material from iron ore mining, for example, does not have the compositional characteristics needed to react and store CO2. In summary, it would appear that potential deployment of carbon capture and sequestration technologies in Minnesota could involve activities such as capture of CO2 at ethanol plants or generating stations that utilize fossil fuels, capture of CO2 from the atmosphere, export of CO2 by pipeline, deep injection of CO2 in a liquid-like state into rocks that will not react with the CO2 within Minnesota, for which probability of success is very low due to our geology, reaction of CO2 with potential mine waste to produce a solid product, and or injection of CO2 into rocks with which it will react to form a solid product. In closing, I want to say that I have appreciated this opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Thorlovsen. Any questions? Any questions? Yes, Senator Prince.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is it Dr. Thorlovsen?
Yes.
Doctor, thanks for your testimony. Same questions I had for Mr. Robbins. We're looking on this committee for perspective, information, thoughts on climate change and the need to decarbonize at the University of Minnesota. Another great school like North Dakota, another great hockey team. Do you have something you want to share with the committee about the urgency? I've used the number 161 millions of carbon Does the university or your work allow you to say to this committee, here's how much of a hurry I think we're in to avoid the worst of climate change, or here's the best way, or I invite any advice that you're willing to share here. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, sorry. My thoughts mirror those of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We've recently heard from the IPC on their views on escalating urgency. The level of urgency that we, the people of Minnesota, choose to place on this topic, to some extent, is based on individual preferences on the level of precaution we want to achieve. What sort of risk do we want to impose on our grandchildren? So I believe we all have personal beliefs that come together as a consensus for the people of the state. The IPC has stated there's escalating urgency, and I don't disagree. Following up, if I may, Mr. Chair, Senator, if I can touch on the current question and your questions to the previous speaker, we need to think in terms of a budget. This legislature spends money. I believe you do so on the basis of a budget in which you bring all of the considerations together and you make choices. And so with respect to CO2, there are multiple approaches to this topic. There could be goals set by the people of this state. There could be regulatory requirements, or it might work quite differently if there are business opportunities. If the financial incentive is there to put carbon in the ground and get a financial reward, a business might pursue that, not to fulfill a regulatory obligation, but to pursue a business opportunity put into place by regulatory considerations. But ultimately, I completely agree with you, we need to look at numbers. What are the total emissions, and what are our options to either pursue goals or to seize opportunities? And so there were good questions addressed to the previous speaker on the capacity of the geological storage. The capacity of geological storage is large. Who knows? We might be more limited in being able to capture this stuff. There's emerging technology that will take CO2 out of the air, but in terms of more established technology, you need to get your hands on the CO2. That's quite readily done at ethanol plants, but then you need to turn to smokestacks. We have many sources like trucks and cars and chimneys that are just difficult to capture because they're so scattered. So we might run out of achievable capture opportunities before we run out of geological storage opportunities. If we can run a pipeline to North Dakota and everyone is in agreement that we can do this, absolutely. North Dakota has excellent geology, but right here in Minnesota, things are coming into focus on the mineral carbonation option with respect to multiple potential sites in the Duluth complex. Very recent news from the Department of Energy working with the companies at the Tamarack project. Clearly there's great potential there that could fulfill regulatory obligations and pursue business opportunities at the same time.
Friends?
Thank you again, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Doctor. If I'm following correctly, you generally are in support of the IPC report, and that report we know says escalating urgency. Is that a fair statement?
Mr. Chair and Senator, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Anybody else, questions? Anybody online within the committee? Any questions? It's not. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your testimony and your information you provided us today. It's actually fascinating.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, let's move on then to Chris Hill of Summit Carbon Solutions. Actually, we have a couple of people from Summit Carbon. Why doesn't Jake come up as well? Jake Kirchner. So do we have that? Ketzner. Are they online? Okay.
I'm online.
Mr. Hill, are you online with us?
Mr. Chair, I am.
Very good. There you are. Okay. Please introduce yourself and proceed as you are ready. And we see your slides.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Chris Hill with Summit Carbon Solutions. I'm the Director of Environmental and Permitting. I'm grateful for the opportunity to present to you today on a quick overview of a transformational project that Summit Carbon is pursuing. Our project is truly what's happening next and has a large positive economic and environmental benefit for Minnesota and the greater Midwest area. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Senator Benson for bringing the bill and this important topic forward. So Summit Carbon Solutions is based in Ames, Iowa. We're pursuing the world's largest integrated carbon capture and transportation and storage business. So our project is founded on 3 main steps. The first step is capturing the carbon from ethanol facilities, specifically the fermentation process, where that carbon is currently being emitted to the atmosphere. Currently, we have approximately 8 million metric tons of CO2 under contract, and that's with 31 ethanol facilities across 5 states, including Minnesota. So after we capture that carbon from the fermentation process and we compress it down, increasing the pressure as some of the other experts described, we're injecting it into a pipeline, or planning to inject it into a pipeline network that spans nearly 2,000 miles. And we hope, pending permitting approval and authorization, will be complete in 2024. The third step of the process is the injection wells, which Mr. O'Connor described quite eloquently and way better than I possibly could. So, but that is the third step, that geological sequestration, permanent sequestration in North Dakota. The design capacity of this project will be approximately 12 million metric tons per year. I imagine a lot of you don't work in millions of metric tons per year unit. I don't myself, so putting that into relative terms, that's equivalent to taking 2.6 million cars off the road and the CO2 emissions associated with that. So we're engineering this project across 5 states, including Minnesota, to accommodate a growth in volumes. So we talked about the 8-9 million metric tons that we currently have contracted. So ethanol plants have signed long-term agreements with us to capture that carbon, but we'll have increased capacity in the system. The map shown here on the slide, the blue dots are the ethanol plants that we have under contract, but you can see there's a lot of other ethanol plants within the project footprint that we're still talking with, and we're still discussing them potentially joining our system. And there's some other projects in this area that are also looking to capture their CO2 as well. Once again, we'll be the largest carbon capture and storage project once commissioned. We'll have some oversized infrastructure, and ability to accommodate some additional volumes. We're partnering with best-in-class biofuel facilities to ultimately access low-cost inputs. So ethanol is the cheapest, or one of the cheapest carbon sources to capture CO2 from, and that's why we're targeting those with this project. Zooming into the state of Minnesota, you can see on this map the project footprint. So the stars on this map are the ethanol facilities that we have contracts with. The red lines are where the pipeline to basically gather that CO2 is located. The pipeline size in Minnesota ranges from 4 inches to 8 inches in the state of Minnesota. Across the system as a whole, the pipeline size ranges from 4 inches to 24 inches. We have 5 current partners located in Minnesota that are shown on the slide. It's approximately 150 miles of anticipated pipeline. And so this provides you a quick overview of where we're planning to be in the state of Minnesota, and the partners that we're working with currently. So once again, there's going to be about 2,000 miles of newly installed pipeline. Design capacity is 12 million metric tons, and that'll be connecting 2.8 billion gallons of ethanol to our infrastructure to collect the CO2 from their fermentation process. The biorefinery partner companies across the project are shown below on the slide. And then once again, you see the partners that we have in Minnesota to the right of the slide. So the opportunity to scale and a transformational carbon capture platform is extremely large, and Minnesota has a huge role in that process. When it comes to the science, just kind of conceptualizing what we're talking about from a mass balance perspective, if you think about 3 pounds of corn getting put into an ethanol process, currently a pound of ethanol is produced from that, a pound of dried distiller grain, and about a pound of CO2. Of course, the ethanol is monetized and the dried distiller grain is monetized for feeding livestock, but the CO2 is being emitted to the atmosphere. And so in addition to the environmental benefits associated with capturing that, there's large economic benefits. And what we're trying to do is help realize both those environmental and economic benefits by installing this infrastructure. So enhancing the long-term profitability of the ethanol and agriculture industry is our goal. And to conceptualize how the markets work and how the project's revenue works, there's 2 primary revenue streams for a project like ours. One is the federal 45Q tax credits, and then 2 is the uplift in ethanol margins associated with selling that ethanol into low carbon fuel markets. For instance, California, Oregon, Washington, parts of Canada. So these ethanol plants, when they sell into those low carbon fuel markets, they get paid a premium. They can use that premium to either enhance their plant capacity, install additional environmental controls, pollution controls, and of course they're going to use it to buy corn and feedstock from farmers across their footprint or their area. And so 40% of all corn supplies in the U.S. go to ethanol production. And so you can see that's a huge driver for keeping crop prices at a high or sustainable level. And you can see the benefit to the communities that are within the vicinity or that are the ethanol plants are procuring corn from. So the ethanol and the agriculture industry working together to add value across the supply chain, as well as create economic impact and jobs for rural America is the goal. So the ethanol industry across the U.S. contributes about $43 billion to the gross domestic product. About $1.5 billion of that is in Minnesota. And when you look at it from a jobs perspective, in the United States, there's about 340 jobs supported by the ethanol industry across the U.S., and about 14,500 of those jobs are in Minnesota. And so ensuring the long-term viability of the ethanol and the agriculture industry is critical for Minnesota's economy and the economy across the Midwest. So as it comes to Summit Carbon Solutions and the economic benefits associated with this project, the project is currently estimated to need a $4.5 billion capital investment with operations beginning in 2024. And there will be a lot of jobs created. So the estimate for job creation for the construction of this project is between 14,000 and 17,000 jobs during construction. And then you have about 350 to 450 jobs, high-paying, high-quality jobs during operation. Summit Carbon is committed to utilizing local contractors, local suppliers, local businesses to provide ongoing economic benefits to those communities and the Midwest in general. So diving in a little bit more into the specifics around each one of the components of this project, before I do, I just want to express Summit Carbon's commitment to safety. So we can talk about the environmental benefits, we can talk about the economic benefits till we're blue in the face. But safety is the #1 priority, and nothing matters. Those benefits don't matter if we can't do this safely. We're confident we can. We're confident that there's regulatory regimes in place to ensure that we will, and we have a commitment to that goal. So when it comes to the capture side of the project, I already discussed this is coming off the ethanol fermentation process. These facilities will be installed on or adjacent to the ethanol facilities themselves. So think about these facilities, these compressors, these dehydration units. They will be on the ethanol site or just adjacent to it. The next step is pipeline. And so our pipeline will be installed at a minimum of 4 feet. In the state of Minnesota, it's actually 52 inches is the requirement, but across the project, it will be a minimum of 4 feet. This is actually going beyond the 3-foot requirement associated with federal regulations. The federal regulations that we would point you all to, and we point all of our stakeholders to, that we're governed by, and all pipelines across the transmission pipelines across the U.S. are governed to, is the Department of Transportation Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. Their regulations, specifically 49 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 195, governs our pipeline. And so I'd like to point stakeholders to that regulations because it defines the strict requirements associated with a project like ours for the design, the construction, the operation, the preparedness associated with emergency response are all defined in those regulations. But just to give you a flavor of the construction of the pipeline, we will be constructing the pipeline out of high-strength carbon steel. It'll have wall thicknesses ranging from 0.2 to 3/4 of an inch. And I already discussed that it's between 4 and 24 inches. We also have to have, as part of the regulation, we have to do dispersion analysis. We have to understand, we have to have an emergency response plan. We have to have a leak detection system. We have to hydraulically statically test this pipeline above and beyond the pressures that it will ever be exposed to in operation. And that's all included in 49 CFR Part 195. Kevin did such an amazing job talking about the geologic storage aspect of it. I'm gonna not try to get into that too much in this presentation because he did an amazing job and he is a part of the project and EERC is a part of our project. We're relying on their expertise to ensure that the geologic storage, the wells, how we're monitoring them, how we're designing them, how we're investigating the geology, we're looking at hazards. We're doing that with the assistance of EERC.
Mr. Hill, can I just ask, because we have about 12 minutes left, there's a lot of material here. We have slides, so, I would just suggest you probably try not to maybe over-explain your slides just in the essence of time. I hate to tell you that, but it's the way it is.
Mr. Chair, I totally understand, and I'll keep it short and sweet. So, once again, safety. We're relying on safe and proven technology. There's a strong regulatory framework associated with it. I won't belabor this slide. CO2 pipelines and this technology is not new, but it's new to this area, and we acknowledge that.
Okay.
Yeah, Kevin talked about the geologic sequestration. I won't belabor this as well. Just reinforcing there's 250 billion metric tons of capacity in North Dakota, and our design capacity is 12 million metric tons. There's ample space, and there's a process that we are undergoing and strict requirements from a regulatory standpoint. So key takeaways, $4.5 billion capital investment across 5 states, a lot of jobs created, 12 million metric tons of CO2 captured and stored every year. Every month that we're not in operation, that's 1 million metric tons of CO2 that's getting released to the atmosphere that it's not economic to recover and sequester or capture and sequester. We'll significantly reduce the ethanol carbon intensity for those ethanol plants that are connected to us, with the hopes that we're helping lead them towards being a net zero transportation fuel, which has huge environmental benefits and also economic benefits for the ethanol and agriculture industry. The project's utilizing safe and proven technology. Mr. Chair, that's the end of my presentation. I'll look questions or anything.
Thank you very much. And is Mr. Ketzner going to speak to those slides? Is that the plan here today? Or are they just offered to us in our packet? You know?
Mr. Chair, those were just backup materials for y'all's
Okay.
reference.
So I do have one quick question. It's almost outside of the whole spectrum of the technology. It's just, it's not even probably within the jurisdiction of this committee, but you know, I read within the week that Summit's having problems in Iowa with landowners and a little resistance to pipes going over their ground. And I don't know the Iowa laws, but you know, the Minnesota laws, at least with respect to condemnation and the procurement of land and easements and so on and so forth. Does your company generally plan to attempt to work with the landowners and buy the easements for the pipe? Is that the plan?
Absolutely, Mr. Chair. We are totally focused on seeking voluntary easements with landowners and going through fair negotiations with them. Yes, sir.
Okay. Senator Frantz?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Hill. Thanks for mentioning high-paying, high-quality jobs. Those of us that represent areas where they grow corn and sell it appreciate that. Do you plan to use Minnesota labor for this project, the part that's in Minnesota?
Mr. Hill?
Mr. Chair, yes, sir. We plan to use Minnesota labor for this project.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions on this one? If not, thank you. Did you say that, you know, if the stars line up, it's 2024? Is that it, that we might see this in place?
Mr. Chair, yes. So with pending permit approval, we would like to or anticipate to start construction of this project in March, April timeframe of 2023 with the hopes of commissioning the system in 2024.
Okay.
Mid-2024, most likely.
Can you give us 30 seconds on 45Q, the tax credit?
The short answer is it's about $50 per metric ton of CO2 that's permanently sequestered. You get a tax credit for that.
And that probably makes it the project financially feasible, or at least a business case for it.
Those federal incentives in conjunction with the state incentives for low carbon fuel standard markets definitely makes this project viable. Those are our two revenue sources. And without the support from the federal government and states like Minnesota and bringing bills like this forward, showing that support, projects like ours are not possible.
I just got one more. For the ethanol plant itself, they're probably going to have to pay Summit to use their pipe, but their business case is that they're going to get more for their product in California or Oregon or whatever. Is that right?
Mr. Chair, there's varying projects that are out there related to carbon capture and pipeline and sequestration. Our project's business model is that they sign long-term agreements with us. We front all the capital. And then we construct the project, and then how it works is we split after removing operating costs, the additional revenue or uplift from them selling their ethanol into low carbon fuel markets. So they are not, it's not a typical pipeline model where they pay a tariff. We're actually just splitting the upside from the increased margins from selling into ethanol, low carbon fuel markets.
It's old. Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Hill. Let's move on then. I really appreciate you being with us today. Let's move on to Sarah Morandon. Is that it, Sarah? Are you on?
Meridian.
Meridian?
Close. Yes, thank you.
All right. There you are. Please proceed when you're ready. Introduce yourself.
Perfect.
And again, proceed.
Thank you, Chair Senchum, committee members. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Sarah Meridian, and I am the Government Relations and Policy Director at Clean Up the River Environment, or CURE. As a rural organization dedicated to uplifting rural voices and strengthening rural communities, CURE is concerned that SF 3661 would not achieve its stated climate goals and would in fact harm rural Minnesotans. There are three things that we believe should give the committee pause in their support of this bill. First, carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, CCUS, does not deliver on its climate promises. Second, that CCUS is not economically viable without significant investment from taxpayers. And third, that developing CCUS technology without consideration for or consultation with the communities impacted by this technology could allow private out-of-state corporations to line their own pockets while our rural communities shoulder the economic, environmental, and health burdens these projects may pose. As you've heard today, many proponents of CCUS point to the IPCC report for support in saying that we need CCUS technology to solve our climate crisis. But if you read the IPCC report, the argument is much more nuanced. The report states that for carbon dioxide removal techniques generally, also known as CDR, which covers a wide variety of practices, the faster reduction of net CO2 emissions in a 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to 2 degrees Celsius pathways is predominantly achieved by measures that result in less CO2 being produced and emitted, and only to a smaller degree through additional CDR. The report also warns that, quote, there is substantial uncertainty about the adverse effects of large-scale CDR deployment on the environment and societal sustainable development goals. It is not fully understood how land use and land management choices for large-scale bioenergy and carbon capture and sequestration, or BECCS, will affect various ecosystem services and sustainable development, and how they further translate into indirect impacts on climate, including greenhouse gas emissions other than CO2. I'd also like to point out that recent attempts at scaling up CCUS have failed to a commercial size. In 2016, the Petronova coal plant located in Houston, Texas, installed CCUS technology on one of its 4 coal units. The goal was to achieve 90% CO2 capture efficiency over a 3-year period. Now, according to the plant's final report, the 3-year carbon capacity average was 92.4%, which sounds impressive. But in total, Petronova missed its overall goal of capturing 4.2 million metric tons of CO2 by 662,000 metric tons. And as one report notes, these calculations don't take into account the 1.1 million metric tons of CO2 emitted from the gas-fired turbine used to operate the CCUS equipment. Furthermore, the CO2 captured at Petronova was then used in oil fields for enhanced oil recovery, which, as the name suggests, allows for further capture of oil in depleted wells. That in turn releases additional emissions when the fuel is burned. I'd also like to say that even if the CCUS projects are deployed at the scale proponents would urge, the technology is estimated to only remove between 210 and 250 million metric tons annually of CO2 emissions by 2030. For context, that's about 4% of the nation's 2020 emissions. This total also assumes that the CCUS technology would work as promised, which, as we've seen from Petronova, may not be a given. It also assumes that none of the CO2 captured would be used for enhanced oil recovery, and that using the technology does not itself increase emissions due to greater energy demands at the facilities on which they're located. Despite federal assistance, CCUS technology has also remained uneconomic at a commercial scale. Industry leaders said it best in a 2019 report on federal policies needed to make CCUS viable. The report states that, quote, effective implementation of the 45Q federal tax credit is crucial to providing the financial certainty and flexibility needed to leverage the intended private investment in projects to achieve the full carbon emissions reduction, energy and industrial production, and job creation benefits. We have also already seen from Petronova that even with an injection of federal money, CCUS may not be economically feasible. Petronova CCUS project cost $1 billion, $195 million of which came from federal funding. Despite that investment, Petronova currently captures 0% of CO2 emissions because of low oil prices, causing the CCUS technology to be shuttered. Finally, we ask the committee to critically analyze who will benefit from widespread development of CCUS technology in Minnesota if these projects do not deliver on their climate promises and rely on taxpayer money to be economically viable. What do Minnesotans get out of the deal? For example, Summit and Navigator, the two pipelines that are proposed in Minnesota, have promised that these pipelines will provide thousands of jobs and sequester up to 12 or 15 million metric tons, respectively, of CO2 annually. They've also promised one-time payments for permanent easements over landowners' properties for the pipeline route and a 3-year payment plan for any crop damage after the pipeline is constructed. Yet these private, out-of-state companies look to make continued long-term profits from these projects, long after the construction of the pipeline is completed and the 3-year payment period has ended. We're also concerned that the development of CCUS technology is being done to rural communities and not with their interests and concerns in mind. While landowners in the pathway of these pipelines have raised concerns over safety and their ability to say no to companies who want to use their land, decision makers have not sought to actively engage these communities in the decision-making process. In conclusion, Minnesota does need to act now to achieve its climate goals. On this, we do agree. But this should not happen at the expense of rural Minnesotans. Instead of using taxpayer money to line the pockets of private out-of-state corporations, we should invest that money back into our communities and engage the communities in deciding where that money goes. CARE respectfully requests that the members of the committee bring these considerations into their deliberations over SF 3661. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Ms. Brandon. Or is that close? Okay. Any questions of Ms. Miranda, Senator Rarick?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Ms. Meridian. You're opposed to this because of the use of tax money being used to incentivize it. Is your group also opposed to the past use of incentives for wind and solar and for any continued incentives around wind and solar?
Ms. Miranda.
That's a good question. Thank you, Senator Rarick. Sorry, Chair Senjum.
Ms. Miranda?
Yeah. I think our key problem with this is that we're concerned that by using taxpayer money for what has been, as I mentioned, unproven at the scale that is being suggested right now, that these will be costly mistakes that taxpayers don't get to see the benefit from. I'd also note that in some ways, again, as I mentioned, this could also allow for the dying fossil fuel industry to continue on when it's uneconomic, which we have seen already.
Senator Rarick?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I guess I would just say when wind and solar technologies were first emerging, we could have said those same exact comments, that will we ever see the benefits come from this? So I think, Mr. Chair and members, I think this is a bill that moves us towards the idea of giving us another option, and let's watch and see how technologies emerge. And I think that's something as stewards of the environment and of taxpayer money that we should be looking at and having every option on the table. And this is not a mandate on anything, telling companies they have to do carbon sequestration. It's saying we want this as an option in Minnesota to be considered. And with that, Mr. Chair, you know, I'm a co-author of Senate File 3661, and I know it was Senator Benson's wish to go to the floor, and so I would like to make a motion to take Senate File 3661 off the table.
I have no objection to that. I wasn't aware of that that desire, but we can certainly do that and vote on the bill here today. Are there any other questions of the witness before we take the question up?
If I may, Chair
Yes.
Senjum?
Yeah.
Just in response to Senator Rarick's
Sure.
comments. I agree that everything shouldn't necessarily be on the table, especially in such an intense time for climate. But I would again like to point out that even the most generous estimations have said that it would only remove CCUS technology 4% of our global emissions in 2020.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think anyone has tried to allude that carbon sequestration is going to solve 100% of the problem. It's one of the options on the table. And if it can do 4%, that's 4%. And as technology emerges, it might get to 25%. And that would be a huge improvement. So I think this bill is one of our steps that we should be taking as we move forward, so that, one, putting this in statute, it also puts it on the table for the PUC to consider.
Senator, I'm not sure if it's Frentz or Newton first.
I've got seniority.
Okay, you got seniority. All right, perfect.
I can't deny that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question I have, Senator Eerc, is when we look at the bill, it implies that this is the only way that we can control carbon emissions. And I think after the excellent testimony of Dr. Thorlovsen, that there are other ways of doing things other than sequestering the carbon in rock in North Dakota. So if we could change the wording on the bill so that it shows this is one of various types of sequestration, so that it doesn't imply somewhere down the line that it's the only one. That's all.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, to that comment, I would respectfully disagree. This is not specifically calling out the sequestering it in the ground in North Dakota. It is saying sequestration in general. And we heard, a second option of, from the university, and this opens up multiple options for any type of sequestration technology that might emerge. It's not, this bill does not limit it to just injecting it in the ground.
Senator Newton, I had the same feelings a little earlier, but on line 19, where it says, a method, it doesn't say the method. And a method, in my mind, would suggest that there are other options available. But I have to confess, I had the same feeling as I read the language until I came to just, again, looking at the words. And a method, I don't think suggests any exclusivity. Senator Trent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, the motion before the committee is to take it off the table.
Yes.
Okay.
He moved to take it off the table. Yes.
Right. But I would indicate.
Why don't we take it off the table? I'm not sure if a motion to take it off the table is debatable. Is it? Why don't we move to take it off the table? Senator Eerc moved to take it off the table. Let's go through the vote. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Okay, it is off the table. Now, Senator Eerc, would you move the adoption of the bill for discussion? Okay. Yes, Senator Frentz.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Eerc. Now that it's off the table, I do read on line 1.8, it is the policy of the state to support the development and deployment of carbon capture and sequestration technologies. So I do share the concern of Senator Newton. This is something that goes to the Public Utilities Commission, and we want to be very careful about the signals that we send. I agree with the spirit of what I hear you saying, Senator Eerc, which is that this is an option we want to keep on the table. I'm just a little concerned about the language, and would Senator Benson have stayed, I would have asked her, would she be okay with an oral amendment along the lines of, it is a policy of the state, something that says we're not putting one in front of the other. That would be my comment on the bill itself. Like Senator Newton, like other members of our delegation, think we should be looking at it, would not want to suggest to the PUC it has any primacy over any of the other carbon reduction options. That would be my comment to the moving of the bill. Absent those changes, Mr. Chair, I think I'd be a no on the bill.
I think Senator Benson, as she was proposing this bill, talked about we need all options. So I don't, if we needed to clarify that, I don't think she'd object to that. Senator Eerc?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess I think we have a lot of things where we say it is the policy, but it doesn't mean it is the only one. We're listing that as, if you follow what I'm saying on it, the policy of the state is this, but it doesn't make it unique or individual. And so it's the policy that this is a method. It's not saying it's the only method to remove CO2 from the atmosphere.
Ms. Carlin, if we throw this into lawyer land, again, I tend to agree with Senator Eerc just said that, it is the policy that this, technology be a method, but not the only method.
Well, Mr. Chair, members, I would sort of agree that I don't know if I've ever seen it as it is a policy of this state. For example, I'm just looking at 216H02 for the greenhouse gas emissions control. For the goal, it says it is the goal of the state to reduce. It doesn't say it is a goal. I just think that's kind of the terminology that's used when the legislature states a goal and then goes on to say something else, like that is the policy or the goal. I don't know if I've ever seen it as a policy or a goal, but that would be up to debate as you're doing right now. So,
Senator Friends, I would say in line 19, if it didn't say a, but it said the, then I'd agree with you 100%. But it doesn't say the, it says a, and so in my mind that leaves the options open for anything else you can think of. Senator Friends.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Eerc. Thank you, Ms. Joel-Fontaine. That is exactly where my concern is. I do not mean to vote for this bill if it intends to put it on the level of for example, a renewable energy standard. I do think carbon capture is something we're looking at, but if the intent of the language here is to say that is on an equal footing with our renewable energy goals by 2035, I think it goes farther than I think we're ready to go. I do not mean it to be a goal of the state to deploy carbon capture sequestration, only to keep looking at it, and that it is a policy to keep taking that look. And I guess what I'd say, Senator Eerc, is if you're concerned about changing that first "the" on line 1.8, well, now I'm concerned about it. If it doesn't matter, let's go ahead and change it. If it's significant to you, then it's significant to me, and I'd like to know a little more about why that change matters. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Senator Eerc?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess, as was stated by staff, I think this is the way it is typical. It is worded in all phases, and this was put together, by our staff. So I believe it is in the correct terminology, and it is in the form that our chief author wishes it to be in. And so at this time, I would ask to leave it the same, but I would be willing to wager. Senator Chamberlain didn't catch that. He didn't. I would be willing to wager that Senator Benson will be open to some discussion, that if that needs to change, we would be open. But at this point, I believe it is correct, and we should leave it as it is.
Okay. Senator Friends?
Mr. Chair, I appreciate the comments from Senator Eerc, my good colleague. Having said that, I'd request a roll call to pass the bill out of committee. Thank you.
Okay. Senator Newton, anything? Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Senate File 3661, then, as presented with a motion to adopt and to refer to the floor. All in favor say aye. Pardon me. We have a roll call. I'm sorry. Ms. Kleinvold.
I am paying attention.
Chair Senzum.
Aye.
Senator Matthews. Senator Frentz.
No.
Senator Chamberlain.
Yes.
Senator Newton. No. Senator Rarick.
Yes.
Senator Torres-Ray.
no.
Senator Utke.
Yes.
Okay, members, on a vote of 4 to 3, the motion to adopt Senate File 3661 and refer it to the floor is approved. With that, any other business here? Comments from anybody? Sensing none, all in favor of a motion to adjourn, say aye. The meeting is adjourned.